Hey, Reddit. I don't usually do this, spill my guts to strangers on the internet. But I've been carrying this story for so long that I feel like it's time to let it out. Maybe someone out there will understand. My name's Eddie, and for over 30 years, I lived a double life that started in a place I thought was my sanctuary, a jazz club in Chicago. Music was everything to me growing up. I wasn't the best student, and let's just say I didn't come from a family with much to spare. But my dad had this old vinyl collection, and on one of those dusty records, I heard John Coltrane for the first time. His saxophone spoke to me in a way nothing else ever had. I remember closing my eyes, imagining myself on stage, the spotlight hitting me just right. By the time I was 19, I'd scraped together enough cash to buy a used Selmer saxophone from a pawn shop downtown. She wasn't pretty, dings on the bell, scratches all over, but man, she could sing. I started hanging around this little jazz club called the Velvet Note. It was tucked into an alley on the south side, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Inside, though, it was magical. Warm lighting bathed the tiny stage, and the smell of aged wood and bourbon clung to the air. That's where I met the crew. Mikey Carter, the smooth-talking trumpet player. His smile was as sharp as his suits, always some flashy color, like red or emerald green. Mikey had this Clark Gable charm about him, with slick back hair and a pencil-thin mustache. He could sweet-talk a brick wall into cracking. Bobby James, the drummer, was a giant of a man. Broad shoulders, hands like hammers, but with a touch so light on the sticks it was like he was painting a masterpiece every time he played. He had this deep, gravelly laugh and a tendency to hum while drumming, always just off-key enough to annoy Mikey. Rosie Bennett, our pianist, was the heart of the group. She had these piercing blue eyes that saw right through you and a voice that could silence a room. Rosie always wore her hair in tight curls, and she had this collection of beaded necklaces that jingled softly when she moved. They took me in like family. It wasn't long before we became the house band at the Velvet Note. Playing there every night felt like living the dream. The way the crowd's energy swirled with our music, how the rhythm of the bass and drums seemed to sync with my heartbeat, it was pure magic. For 6 years, life was simple. We played, laughed, and lived for the music. The money wasn't great, but we got by. None of us were looking for trouble. At least, not until that night in 1981. We'd been hired to play a private party at one of those enormous mansions in the Gold Coast neighborhood. You know the type, gates taller than most houses, driveways lined with imported trees, and windows that probably cost more than my saxophone. We didn't ask questions about who hired us or why. Gigs like that paid better than we usually made in a month. The party was surreal, waiters in tuxedos carrying silver trays, champagne fountains, and a crowd of Chicago's wealthiest. Everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. I remember seeing a woman in a red dress with a slit so high it should have been illegal. The way she moved through the room, you could tell she knew she owned it. We played the standards, Take 5, All Blues, and Moanin' Dot. The crowd ate it up. During our break, though, things got strange. A man approached us. He introduced himself as Victor Stone, a big-shot businessman with a deep voice that carried authority. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite, square jaw, steely gray eyes, and not a single strand of his slick-back hair out of place. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than a car. "You've got talent," he said, his voice smooth but heavy. "And talent shouldn't be wasted." Mikey, always the charmer, grinned and said, "We're just here to play tunes, boss. What's on your mind?" Victor smirked. "Let's just say I have an opportunity for you. Something lucrative. Something discreet." Rosie shot me a look. She had this knack for sniffing out trouble, and I could tell her radar was going off. But Mikey? Mikey was already hooked. "Keep talking," he said. Victor leaned in close, lowering his voice. "I'll pay you triple what you're making now, more, even. All you have to do is play at a few more private events for some friends of mine. And, occasionally deliver some packages while you're at it." He said it like it was no big deal. Like he was asking us to carry someone's dry cleaning. But we all knew what he meant. Rosie opened her mouth to say something, but Mikey cut her off. "We'll think about it," he said, flashing his trademark smile. Victor handed us his card, and that was that. On the ride back to the Velvet Note, the car was silent. Even Mikey didn't say much, which was unusual for him. Finally, Rosie broke the silence. "This is a bad idea," she said, her voice firm. But Mikey, ever the optimist, just shrugged. "A bad idea? Or an opportunity? We've been busting our asses for peanuts. Maybe it's time we started making real money." That night, none of us slept. None of us realized we were standing at the edge of a cliff. "Alright, folks, here's where things started spiraling." We didn't jump into Victor's deal right away. For a couple of weeks, the card he gave us sat untouched on the bar counter at the Velvet Note, tucked under an empty glass Mikey swore was his lucky one. But Victor wasn't the kind of guy you just brush off. One night, after a particularly slow gig, 10 people in the crowd, tops, Mikey finally cracked. "We're killing ourselves out here," he said, swirling his drink. "You think Benny Goodman had to hustle like this? Hell no. He probably had 10 Victors paying him to sit in cushy chairs and sip champagne." "Mikey, we're not Benny Goodman," Rosie said, her tone sharp. She'd been against this from the start, but you could see her resolve weakening. Money talks, and we weren't exactly rolling in it. That's when Bobby, usually quiet and laid back, surprised us all. We're already in the kind of life where people don't ask questions. Music and shadows go hand in hand, you know. Maybe this isn't as bad as it seems. I don't know why I didn't speak up. Maybe I thought Mikey and Rosie would argue it out. Maybe I wanted to believe Bobby was right. Or maybe I was too scared to admit that the idea tempted me, too. A week later, we made the call. Victor wasted no time setting things up. He invited us to his office downtown, a penthouse suite in a high-rise that overlooked the city. The elevator ride-up felt like stepping into another world: plush carpets, gold trim, the soft hum of jazz piped through hidden speakers. When we walked into his office, Victor was waiting, his back to us as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Welcome," he said without turning around. "I knew you'd see reason." The deal was laid out plainly: we'd play at exclusive parties for Victor and his associates. Between sets, we'd deliver packages to designated guests, always sealed, always anonymous. No questions asked. The money was enough to make our heads spin. "I'll be clear," Victor said, his voice colder now. "This isn't a game. If you agree, you're in. No backing out, no second guessing. Understood?" We nodded. What else could we do? The first job. The first gig under Victor's watch felt like walking into a movie. We were booked to play at a sprawling estate in Lake Forest. The house looked like something out of The Great Gatsby, complete with marble columns, a fountain in the driveway, and security guards in black suits stationed at every corner. Inside, the air buzzed with wealth and excess. Chandeliers cast golden light on guests dressed in designer clothes, their laughter echoing through the grand hall. The music we played fit the vibe perfectly, but I couldn't focus. My hands were sweating so much I nearly dropped my sax. Between sets, a young man in an all-white suit approached me. He couldn't have been more than 22, with a face that screamed privilege, sharp cheekbones, perfectly styled blonde hair, and a smug smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Eddie, right?" he said, barely waiting for my nod before slipping an envelope into my saxophone case. "Give this to the lady in the black gown near the balcony. Don't open it." I glanced at Mikey, who was nodding at me from the stage. He'd already gotten his instructions, and was in the middle of passing off something to another guest. Rosie was on edge, her fingers trembling over the keys of her piano as she watched everything unfold. I found the woman easily, a striking brunette with emerald earrings that looked like they could pay off my apartment for a year. She accepted the envelope without a word, slipping it into her clutch before disappearing into the crowd. By the end of the night, we each walked away with an envelope of our own, stuffed with more cash than I'd ever seen in one place. It felt like winning the lottery, but there was no denying the heaviness in the air. "See?" Mikey said as we piled into our van. "Easy money. Nobody got hurt." Rosie didn't reply. She just stared out the window, clutching her envelope like it might explode. Cracks in the foundation. For a while, the money made it easier to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. We bought better instruments, paid off debts, even upgraded our wardrobes. The Velvet Note started drawing bigger crowds, thanks to the reputation we were building in Victor's circles. But things changed. Victor began requesting more than just deliveries. There were strange instructions, whispered warnings about being careful who we talk to. The parties became darker, more intense. Guests weren't just there to network or sip cocktails, they were making deals that felt heavy, dangerous. One night, at a gala in a downtown hotel, Bobby pulled me aside. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "Eddie, this ain't right," he muttered. "The package I just handed off." The guy opened it right in front of me. It wasn't normal. I didn't ask what he saw. I didn't want to know. But the worst part was the changes in Mikey. He started spending more time with Victor, staying late after gigs to talk business. His flashy suits got flashier, his grin sharper, but there was something hollow behind it. Rosie noticed too. "We've crossed a line," she told me one night after practice. "Mikey's drunk on the power, and it's gonna get us all killed." I wanted to believe she was wrong. I wanted to think we could still walk away. But deep down, I knew better. Victor didn't let people walk away. After that gala, things started unraveling faster than we could keep up. It wasn't one big moment that tipped us over the edge, it was a series of little cracks. Each one seemed manageable on its own, but together they formed a chasm we couldn't escape. Mikey dove deeper into Victor's world. He was the first to say yes when Victor suggested we take on more responsibility. And by responsibility, I mean running packages outside of gigs. "It's just a side hustle," Mikey said, flashing that same damn grin. "The music's still the main gig. This just keeps the lights on." Rosie wasn't having it. "You're kidding yourself," she snapped one night after practice. "This isn't about the music anymore, Mikey. It's about the money. And you're dragging us into something none of us signed up for." "Then leave," Mikey shot back, his voice colder than I'd ever heard. "But don't expect to keep your cut." That shut her up, but the look on her face said it all. The drop that changed everything. The turning point came during a gig at a high-end lounge downtown. The place was sleek and modern, all polished chrome and glass. The kind of spot where drinks cost more than my monthly rent. Victor himself showed up that night, which was rare. Usually, he stayed behind the curtain, pulling strings while we played. But this time, he stood in the back, watching us with those cold, calculating eyes of his. During our break, he motioned for us to join him in a private lounge upstairs. "You've proven yourselves," he said, pouring whiskey into a crystal glass. "So tonight, I have a special request." He slid a black briefcase across the table. "Take this to the gentleman sitting at the bar downstairs. He's wearing a gray suit and a red tie. Make sure he gets it directly. And don't open it." Mikey, ever the eager one, reached for the case. But Rosie grabbed his arm. "What's in it?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes blazing. Victor's expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "It's better if you don't ask questions, Ms. Bennett. Curiosity has a way of ending careers." That was Victor's way of saying, "Don't push me." We delivered the case, just like he asked. The man in the gray suit barely looked at us as he took it and disappeared into the night. But something about the whole exchange felt wrong. Rosie walks away. After that night, Rosie couldn't take it anymore. She quit the band. "I'm done," she told us, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "I love you guys, but I can't do this. It's not who I am. It's not who we are." Mikey tried to stop her, but she was already halfway out the door. "You think you can just walk away?" he yelled after her. "You think Victor's gonna let you go?" Rosie turned back, her eyes filled with tears. "I'd rather take my chances out there than spend another second playing his game." And just like that, she was gone. For weeks, we didn't hear from her. I kept expecting to see her walk through the door of the Velvet Note, her necklaces jingling, her smile lighting up the room. But she didn't. Victor's warning. One night, Victor called a meeting. It wasn't at his office this time, it was at a private club in the West Loop. The place was dark and moody, with heavy leather chairs and walls lined with books that I doubt anyone had ever read. Victor didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ms. Bennett's departure is unfortunate," he said, his tone as cold as ever. "But let me be clear, this operation does not tolerate loose ends." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Victor leaned back in his chair, his steely eyes locking onto mine. "Let's just say I expect loyalty. From everyone. If someone decides they no longer want to be part of the team, they become a liability. And liabilities are dealt with." Mikey shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't say a word. Bobby looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but there. Victor's message was clear, Rosie wasn't just gone, she was in danger. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Victor's words in my head, wondering if Rosie was okay, if she'd managed to slip out of his grasp. Deep down, I knew we were in too deep. And if we didn't find a way out soon, we'd end up just like her, or worse. After Rosie left, things changed. The band felt hollow. Sure, we could still play the tunes. Bobby still had his rhythmic magic, and Mikey's trumpet solos could light up a room. But without Rosie, our music lost its soul. Victor didn't care. He wasn't paying us for the music anymore. The gigs kept coming, bigger and riskier. The parties weren't just for rich people blowing off steam, they were meeting grounds for power plays, backroom deals, and the kind of business that made me want to shower just being near it. A familiar face. A month after Rosie disappeared, we were booked at a luxurious yacht party on Lake Michigan. It was freezing out, one of those nights where the wind off the lake cuts through every layer of clothing. But inside the yacht, it was warm, decadent, and blindingly extravagant. I was setting up my sax when I spotted her. Rosie. She was standing near the bar, dressed to blend in, black cocktail dress, hair swept up, and a glass of champagne in her hand. But her eyes weren't sparkling like the other guests. They darted around the room, scanning, calculating. Before I could call out to her, she disappeared into the crowd. The sight of her shook me. What was she doing here? Had she been pulled back into Victor's orbit? Or was she trying to escape it? I didn't have much time to think. During our second set, Victor appeared, flanked by two men I didn't recognize. They were tall, broad, and as intimidating as they come. The kind of guys who didn't need to say anything to make you nervous. Victor didn't usually show up at gigs anymore, so seeing him there set off alarm bells. He watched us play, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. When we finished, he motioned for Mikey and me to join him in a private room below deck. The job gets messy. The room was small, dimly lit, and reeked of cigar smoke. Victor gestured for us to sit, then placed a small, silver case on the table in front of us. "This is an important delivery," he said, his voice as calm and calculated as always. "It goes to a man waiting at the harbor when we dock. No detours, no delays." Mikey nodded, "All business." "Got it, boss." But I couldn't keep quiet anymore. "What's in the case, Victor?" I asked. Victor's eyes flicked to me, cold and hard. "I've told you before, Eddie. You don't ask questions. Do your job, and you'll be rewarded." Something about the way he said it made my stomach churn. But I nodded, because what else could I do? When we docked, Mikey and I carried the case to the meeting point. The man waiting for us was young, probably no older than 25. He had dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made him look like he was ready to bolt at any moment. "You have it?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mikey handed him the case. But before he could take it, a loud voice boomed behind us. "Chicago PD. Hands in the air. The sting." Suddenly, the harbor was flooded with flashing lights and shouting officers. Mikey froze, the case still in his hand. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "Drop it," one of the officers shouted, his gun trained on us. Mikey hesitated for a split second, then dropped the case. It hit the ground with a metallic clang, and the young man bolted. 2 officers tackled him before he made it 10 feet. I don't know how we weren't arrested on the spot. Maybe Victor pulled strings. Maybe the cops were more interested in the young guy and whatever was in that case. But we got out of there, shaken and silent. Victor's wrath. When we returned to the Velvet Note, Victor was waiting for us. He was furious, but not in the way you'd expect. There was no yelling, no threats. Just a quiet, seething anger that was somehow more terrifying. "You failed me," he said, his voice low. "Do you have any idea how much damage you've done?" Mikey tried to explain, but Victor cut him off. "This isn't a game, Michael. You don't get second chances in my world." He stood and straightened his suit. "Consider this your final warning. Step out of line again, and you'll wish the cops had taken you." The breaking point. After Victor left, Bobby and I sat in silence, nursing drinks that did nothing to steady our nerves. "This ain't worth it," Bobby muttered, his voice thick with regret. "The money, the gigs, none of it. We're gonna get ourselves killed." I wanted to agree, but Mikey wasn't ready to hear it. "We just need to be smarter," he insisted. "Stick to the plan, and we'll be fine." But we weren't fine. And deep down, I think Mikey knew it too. After the sting at the harbor, everything felt different. The air around us was heavier, like we were walking through a fog that never lifted. Victor's threat hung over us, unspoken but ever-present. Rosie's face haunted me, too. Why had she been at that yacht party? Was she spying on Victor? Was she in trouble? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading straight for a cliff, and she might already have gone over it. Mikey? He was digging in deeper, as if doubling down could make it all better. Bobby and I started meeting in secret, late at night, talking about ways to get out. But every plan ended the same way, with Victor finding us, and us ending up on the wrong side of a dark alley. Then came the call that changed everything. The offer. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., when Mikey's phone rang. He picked it up, groggy but curious. The moment I saw his face harden, I knew it wasn't good. "We're being summoned," he said after hanging up. "Summoned?" I asked, already dreading what that meant. "Victor wants us at the Velvet Note. Now." When we arrived, Victor was waiting for us, sitting at his usual table near the stage. But he wasn't alone. 2 men sat with him, men I'd never seen before, but their presence set me on edge. They were dressed sharp, but their demeanor screamed trouble. Victor didn't waste time. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth and unyielding. "I have a job for you. A big one. If you pull this off, it will secure your place in this operation. Permanently. Permanently." The word hit me like a brick. "What kind of job?" Bobby asked, his voice trembling slightly. Victor leaned forward, his icy eyes locking onto Bobby. "Let's just say it's a delivery of great importance. A private client. Highly influential. The kind of client who can make or break everything we've built." He slid a manila envelope across the table. "Details are inside. Be at the warehouse on 35th Street tomorrow night. Midnight." Mikey grabbed the envelope without hesitation. Bobby and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us said anything. As we left, Bobby muttered under his breath, "This is it, Eddie. This is where we either get out or get buried." The warehouse meeting. The warehouse was in the industrial part of town, a desolate stretch of crumbling brick buildings and chain-link fences. The kind of place where shadows seem to move on their own. When we arrived, the air was cold and damp. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the only sound the distant hum of machinery. Victor's men were waiting, along with a black van parked in the center of the space. The moment I saw it, my stomach turned. "Load it up," one of the men barked, motioning to several crates stacked against the wall. "What's in them?" Bobby asked, his voice barely audible. The man glared at him. "You don't ask questions." We spent the next hour loading the van in silence. The crates were heavy, and the tension was even heavier. Mikey tried to make small talk, but no one was in the mood. Once the van was loaded, one of the men handed Mikey a piece of paper. "Here's the address. Drive straight there. No stops, no detours." The address wasn't in the city, it was in the suburbs, an affluent area I recognized from old gigs. The trap. We hit the road, Mikey driving, Bobby in the passenger seat, and me in the back with the crates. The drive was quiet, tense. Every car that passed us felt like a threat. When we reached the address, it was a sprawling mansion, tucked away behind tall iron gates. The kind of place that screamed money and power. A man in a dark suit greeted us as we pulled up. He didn't say a word, just motioned for us to follow him around to the back of the house. That's when everything went wrong. As we began unloading the crates, floodlights snapped on, blinding us. Before we could react, voices shouted, "Hands up. Don't move. Cops." Dozens of them. Swarming the property like ants on sugar. Mikey froze, his hands halfway to the crate he was holding. Bobby dropped his and backed away, his face pale. I just stood there, too stunned to move. One of the officers stepped forward, his gun trained on us. "Step away from the vehicle. Now." We did as we were told, our hands in the air. The crates were ripped open, revealing their contents, something that would have guaranteed a lifetime in prison. I glanced at Mikey, who looked more furious than scared. Bobby, on the other hand, looked like he might pass out. Betrayal. As we were being cuffed, a black car pulled up. Victor stepped out, calm as ever, his hands in his pockets. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone almost amused. "I see things didn't go as planned." "What the hell, Victor?" Mikey shouted. "You set us up." Victor shrugged, his cold eyes glinting in the floodlights. "You've been liabilities for a while now. Consider this my way of tying up loose ends." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Victor had used us as scapegoats, pawns in some bigger game we'd never been privy to. As the cops hauled us away, I couldn't stop thinking about Rosie. Was she the lucky one? Or was she just another loose end Victor had tied up? The ride to the precinct was a blur. I was handcuffed, shoved into the back of a police van, wedged between Bobby and Mikey. None of us said a word. What was there to say? Victor had played us, and we'd walked right into his trap. Interrogation. The precinct was cold, sterile. They separated us immediately, putting each of us in different rooms. I sat there under those harsh fluorescent lights, staring at the one-way mirror, waiting. Finally, a detective walked in. He was middle-aged, with a rumpled suit and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd seen one too many late nights. He introduced himself as Detective Harris. "Eddie," he said, flipping open a file. "You've been in some deep waters, haven't you?" I didn't respond. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Here's the deal. We've been watching Victor for years. He's careful, smart. Always has someone else to take the fall. This time, it's you." I felt a chill run through me. "But," Harris continued, "it doesn't have to be that way. You cooperate, and maybe we can help you. Maybe you don't spend the rest of your life in a cell." I hesitated. Could I betray Victor? The man who had betrayed us. The man who had orchestrated Rosie's disappearance. "I don't know anything," I said finally. Harris smirked. "Come on, Eddie. You've been in his orbit for years. You think you don't know things? You've seen how this works. You're not stupid." I kept my mouth shut. Harris stood, his expression hardening. "You're making a mistake, Eddie. A big one." He left the room, and I was alone again. Bobby's breaking point. Hours passed. At some point, I heard shouting through the walls. It was Bobby's voice, filled with anger and desperation. I couldn't make out the words, but it didn't sound good. Later, I found out that Bobby had cracked. He'd told the cops everything he knew, about the deliveries, the clients, the whole operation. I couldn't blame him. Bobby wasn't built for this life. None of us were. Mikey, though. He didn't crack. He sat in his cell, silent and defiant, like a man with nothing left to lose. An unexpected ally. The next morning, I was dragged out of my cell and taken to a new room. Sitting there, looking more out of place than ever, was Rosie. She looked different, tired, worn down. But her eyes still had that fire. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She smirked. "Nice to see you too, Eddie." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "I'm here to get you out of this mess." I stared at her, confused. "How?" She sighed. "After I left, I started working with Harris. They were building a case against Victor, and I gave them everything I had. But they need more. They need you, Eddie. You've seen things I haven't." I shook my head. "I can't. If I talk, Victor will come after me. After us." Rosie's expression softened. "He's already after us, Eddie. The only way to end this is to take him down. Turning the tables." In the end, Rosie convinced me. I told Harris everything, about the gigs, the deliveries, the parties, the clients. It wasn't easy. Every word felt like a betrayal, like I was tearing apart the only life I'd ever known. But I knew it was the only way to survive. Over the next few weeks, the feds moved in. They raided Victor's warehouses, seized his assets, and arrested dozens of his associates. Victor himself? He disappeared. One day he was in Chicago, running his empire, and the next he was gone. Aftermath. The fallout was brutal. Mikey refused to cooperate, and last I heard, he was still in prison. Bobby got a reduced sentence thanks to his cooperation, but he was a broken man when he got out. As for me, I entered witness protection. They gave me a new name, a new life. I moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, far from the jazz clubs and dark alleys of Chicago. I still play my sax, but only for myself now. Sometimes, when the mood strikes, I close my eyes and play the tunes we used to play at the Velvet Note. For a moment, I can almost hear Bobby's steady beat, Mikey's fiery solos, and Rosie's soft, soulful vocals. But then the music fades, and I'm alone again. Final thoughts. Looking back, I don't know if we were victims or fools. Maybe a little of both. All I know is that the life we built, the music, the friendships, the laughter, it was all poisoned the moment we let Victor in. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: no matter how sweet the tune, it's not worth selling your soul to play it. The end. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. It's not easy to share, but it feels good to finally get it out there. Stay safe out there, folks.